I've always been someone who thrives on organization. Every task, every appointment, every deadline goes onto my wall calendar, a big one, dominating the small kitchen in my apartment. Its clean, white squares fill with neat black writing as the month unfolds, every detail meticulously planned. My life might not be thrilling, but at least it's in order. That's why the red ink caught my attention. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that starts with the smell of coffee brewing in sunlight. Peeking through half-drawn blinds, I sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through emails on my phone, when my eyes drifted to the calendar. There it was, scrawled across today's box in bold red letters. Don't forget. I frowned, leaning closer. The words stood out like a fresh wound against the black ink of my other entries. I didn't remember writing it. I sipped my coffee, trying to make sense of it. Was it my handwriting? Kind of. It looked similar. But there was something off about it, like a hurried imitation of my usual neat script. I shook my head, brushing the thought aside. I'd been working late the night before, pushing deadlines and forgetting to eat dinner. Maybe I'd scribbled the note in a moment of exhaustion and forgotten about it. It wouldn't be the first time I'd acted on autopilot. Still, the message unsettled me. The day passed uneventfully. I worked through meetings, emails, and the kind of mundane tasks that blurred together. By lunchtime, I'd almost forgotten about the red ink entirely. But when I came home that evening, my eyes were drawn to the calendar again. The message was still there, the bold letters staring at me like an accusation. Don't forget. I studied it longer this time, my mind turning over the possibilities. Could someone else have written it? The idea felt ridiculous. No one had been in my apartment. I lived alone, and I was meticulous about locking the doors and windows. The only other person with a spare key was the landlord, and he had no reason to mess with my calendar. I reached out and touched the ink, half expecting it to smear. It didn't. The words felt permanent, as though they'd always been there. By the time I went to bed, the unease had settled into a dull ache in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just a fluke or a tired mistake, and pulled the blankets over my head. But that night, I dreamed of red ink. I woke up to a new message. It was written in the same jagged red script, across the box for Wednesday. Pay attention. Pay attention. My stomach twisted as I stared at the words, the coffee pot gurgling behind me. My first instinct was to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I looked closer, the same questions surfaced. When had I written this? Why didn't I remember? And if I hadn't, who had? I was no longer laughing it off. The message that greeted me when I walked into the kitchen chilled me to the core. It wasn't vague like the others. It wasn't something I could dismiss as tired scribblings or forgetfulness. In bold red letters, it read, "Don't trust them." I froze, the mug of coffee I was holding slipping slightly in my grip. The ink looked fresh, the lines sharp and deliberate. This was no accident. Someone or something was writing these messages. The room felt colder than usual, and the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder, more oppressive. My gaze darted to the locked door, then to the windows. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The messages weren't just appearing. They were appearing inside my locked apartment. I spent the rest of the morning trying to rationalize. Maybe I was doing it in my sleep, acting out some strange stress-induced habit. After all, wasn't sleepwalking a thing? It wasn't entirely impossible. Still, the words didn't feel like mine. They weren't written in my usual careful script. The letters were sharp and jagged, slanting in an almost menacing way. And there was the ink itself, a deep, almost glossy red. I didn't even own a red pen. I grabbed my phone and Googled sleep writing phantom messages, unexplained writing, here, and every other keyword I could think of. The results weren't comforting. Forums filled with stories of unexplained phenomena, haunted houses, and cryptic warnings. None of it made me feel any closer to the truth. By the time I came home from work that evening, my stomach was in knots. I hesitated at the front door, the key hovering in my hand. My heart pounded as I turned the lock, half expecting to find someone waiting for me inside. But the apartment was silent, just as I'd left it. I didn't go to the calendar right away. I couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I busied myself with chores, throwing myself into menial tasks to keep my mind occupied. I scrubbed the sink, wiped down the counters, and even reorganized the spice rack, anything to avoid looking at the wall. Eventually, though, I couldn't avoid it any longer. With a deep breath, I turned to face the calendar. The box for Friday was already filled. Be ready. I decided to take action. I wasn't going to let this continue without answers. If someone was sneaking into my apartment to play a sick joke, I was going to catch them. And if it really was me doing this in my sleep, I needed proof. I set up my old webcam in the kitchen, positioning it so it had a clear view of the calendar. Red light blinked steadily as I tested the recording, and a small part of me felt reassured by the tiny piece of technology standing guard. Satisfied, I went about my day as usual. Work, errands, a quick stop at the grocery store. But no matter where I went or what I did, the messages lingered in the back of my mind. What did they mean? Who or what was writing them? And why me? That night, I checked the locks 3 times before going to bed. I left the webcam running, its blinking light the only source of illumination in the darkened kitchen. I didn't sleep well. My dreams were restless, filled with flashes of red ink and the sensation of being watched. When I woke up, I was groggy, my head pounding from lack of rest. But as I stumbled into the kitchen, all thoughts of fatigue vanished. The calendar had a new message. He's coming. The words seemed to glow, the red ink darker and thicker than before. My breath hitched as I grabbed the webcam, my fingers trembling as I opened the recording on my laptop. This was it. Proof. Evidence. But the footage didn't make sense. The video showed me entering the kitchen before bed, checking the locks, and setting up the webcam. After that, the room remained still, bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the blinds. There was no sign of anyone entering the apartment. No movement, no sound. Just the calendar, on the wall, untouched. But as the hours ticked by, something changed. The screen glitched, a faint flicker distorting the image. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but then it happened again. And again. At 3:12 a.m., the screen went black for exactly 6 seconds. When the image returned, the message was there. He's coming. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart racing. The apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls too close. This wasn't normal. This wasn't human. I couldn't bring myself to leave the apartment or stay in it, for that matter. Instead, I sat on the couch, staring at the calendar as though it might change in front of me. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was this some kind of haunting? A ghost? A warning? And if so, what was coming? The hours dragged on, the shadows in the apartment growing longer as evening approached. I debated calling someone, friends, family, even the police, but what would I say? The messages felt like a secret I wasn't meant to share. When the sun finally set, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, my eyes fixed on the blank square for Saturday. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready. Saturday morning came with a message that shattered what little composure I had left. I approached the calendar with my heart in my throat, dreading what I might see. The red ink stood out against the stark white square. But this time, the message wasn't cryptic or vague. It was my name. Kara. I staggered back as though the word itself had struck me, seeing my name written there in that same jagged, unnatural handwriting was different from the warnings before. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was directed at me. Who or what knew my name? The air in the apartment felt heavier, pressing against my chest as I tried to think. This wasn't just a prank. Someone or something was trying to reach me. I spent the morning searching for any sign of intrusion. I checked every lock, every window, every inch of the apartment. But there was nothing, no broken glass, no scratches on the doors, not even a speck of dirt on the floor. I even searched the closets and under the bed, feeling ridiculous the entire time. But the apartment was empty. I was alone. At least that's what I told myself. I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The walls felt suffocating, the calendar an unbearable weight in the room. I grabbed my bag and headed to a nearby coffee shop, hoping that the bustle of people and the smell of freshly brewed coffee might help calm my nerves. It didn't. Even surrounded by strangers, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time the bell above the door jingled, my heart skipped a beat. My eyes darted to every new face, searching for someone or something that didn't belong. But no one paid me any attention. I spent hours there, my coffee growing cold as I scrolled through forums and articles on my phone. I searched for stories of mysterious messages, hauntings, or unexplained phenomena, hoping to find something that mirrored my own experience. One story caught my attention. It was a post buried in an obscure paranormal forum, written years ago. The author described finding strange messages in their home words scrawled on mirrors, walls, and even the pages of books. The handwriting didn't match their own, and the messages always seemed to warn of an impending event. The story ended abruptly. The author hadn't posted again. The last message they'd seen was, "They're here." I left the coffee shop just as the sun was beginning to set. The walk back to my apartment felt longer than usual, the shadows stretching across the pavement like dark tendrils. When I reached the front door, my stomach churned. The door was locked, just as I'd left it. But as I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air was colder, the apartment eerily silent, and then I saw the calendar. The message had changed. It wasn't supposed to. The red ink had always appeared in the morning, as though waiting for me to wake up. But now, there was a new line beneath my name, written in the same jagged hand. "He's watching you." I didn't sleep that night. I tried. I curled up on the couch with the lights on, clutching my phone like a lifeline. But every creak, every whisper of the wind outside sent my heart racing. Around 3 a.m. I heard it. A faint rustling sound, coming from the direction of the kitchen. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The sound came again, soft, deliberate, like the movement of paper. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling as I crept toward the kitchen. The light above the table flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the room. The calendar was blank. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. But then I saw the pen. A red pen, lying on the table beneath the calendar. Its plastic surface gleamed faintly in the light, and I could see smudges of ink on its tip, as though it had just been used. My blood ran cold. I didn't own a red pen. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before picking it up. The plastic felt warm against my skin, almost as though it had been held recently. As I turned it over in my hands, a memory surfaced. The pen looked familiar, too familiar. It was identical to one I'd owned as a child, part of a stationery set my mother had given me for my birthday. But that pen had been lost years ago, long before I'd moved into this apartment. Hadn't it? A faint, metallic smell clung to the ink, sharp and unpleasant. My stomach churned as I set the pen back down, its weight suddenly unbearable. That's when I noticed the smudge on my hand. A small streak of red ink ran across my palm, faint but unmistakable. I stared at it, my mind racing. Had I touched the pen without realizing? Or had I? I couldn't finish the thought. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the blinds, I was no closer to understanding. The calendar greeted me with a new message, as though mocking my fear. "You're not alone." The words burned into my mind as I stared at them. the pen still lying on the table beneath. I wasn't sure anymore. Was I being warned? Or threatened? By Sunday morning, the calendar wasn't just an unsettling curiosity, it was the centerpiece of my unraveling reality. The latest message read, "He's closer now." I couldn't look away from the words, the jagged strokes seeming sharper, more alive than before. The ink looked as though it had been freshly applied, the edges of each letter glistening faintly in the morning light. Though, the apartment felt colder again, the stillness oppressive. My chest tightened as I scanned the room, half expecting to see someone or something standing in the shadows, but the apartment was empty. Wasn't it? I decided to get out, to go anywhere but here. I packed a bag hastily, throwing in clothes, my laptop, and the journal where I'd been documenting everything that had happened over the past few days. The calendar mocked me from its place on the wall. The bright red ink seared into my vision. Even as I tried to ignore it, I had the urge to rip it down, to crumple it up and throw it away. But I didn't. Something deep inside warned me not to. I left the apartment around midday, taking the train to a hotel on the other side of town. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not friends, not family. I couldn't explain the messages without sounding insane, and the idea of hearing someone tell me to calm down made my stomach churn. The hotel was small and unremarkable, the kind of place where no one asked questions. My room was plain but clean, and for the first time in days I felt like I could breathe, until I opened my bag. The calendar was there. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't packed it. I knew I hadn't. It had been on the wall when I left the apartment, and yet, there it was, sitting neatly on top of my clothes, its pristine white pages untouched except for today's box. You can't leave. I slammed the bag shut and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed. My heart thundered in my chest, the room suddenly too small, too suffocating. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a trap. I tried to convince myself the calendar was just an object, that it couldn't hurt me. I tucked it into the closet, closing the door firmly and shoving a chair in front of it for good measure. The room was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioner. I curled up on the bed, my back against the wall, and tried to stay awake. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke, the chair was toppled over and the closet door was open. The calendar was back on the table, its pages splayed open. A new message glared up at me in bold red ink. "Look behind you." I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The words felt like a physical weight pressing down on me, rooting me in place. The room was deathly silent, the air still and cold. Slowly I turned my head, every second, stretching into eternity. There was nothing there. But the shadows in the room seemed deeper now, more oppressive. The faint light from the bedside lamp barely seemed to penetrate them, leaving dark corners where anything could be hiding. My breathing was shallow as I grabbed my phone, opening the camera and switching it to selfie mode. I held it up, angling it behind me. For a moment, the screen showed nothing but the dimly lit room. Then, a shape flickered into view. It was faint, barely distinguishable from the shadows, but it was there, a figure standing just behind me. Its head tilted slightly, as though observing me with a detached curiosity. I dropped the phone, scrambling off the bed and pressing myself against the wall. The shadows, it didn't move, but I could feel the presence, heavy and oppressive, as though it were breathing down my neck. I grabbed the calendar from the table, clutching it in both hands. The red ink seemed to pulse. Faintly, the words swimming before my eyes. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The air in the room seemed to shift, a low hum building in the silence. The pages of the calendar fluttered, though there was no breeze. A single word appeared on the next blank square, the ink scrawling itself across the page in real time. "You?" I don't remember leaving the hotel. My mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline as I bolted from the room, leaving my bag, my phone, and everything else behind. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto a bench in a park miles away. The cool night air stung my lungs, and my vision blurred with tears. It was over. It had to be over. But when I glanced down, the calendar was sitting beside me. The next day's square was already filled. Tomorrow. The word tomorrow burned itself into my mind. I sat on the park bench, the cool night air wrapping around me, the calendar heavy in my lap. Hands shook as I stared at the word written in that familiar, menacing red ink. I didn't know what it meant, but the dread curling in my stomach told me I didn't want to find out. People passed by, joggers, couples, a lone dog walker, but I felt completely alone. Even surrounded by life. The weight of the messages bore down on me, isolating me in a way I couldn't explain. I needed help. I returned to the apartment at dawn, the streets eerily quiet in the early morning light. The shadows of the building stretched long and thin, and every creak of the pavement under my feet made me flinch. The front door was just as I'd left it locked. Yet, stepping inside felt like walking into the lair of something waiting for me. The calendar wasn't where I'd left it. I found it in the middle of the living room floor, lying open. The message for the day was bold and deliberate. It's here. The air in the apartment was thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I backed away, my heartbeat deafening in the silence. Something moved in the corner of my vision. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the farthest corner of the room, the shadows twisted unnaturally, writhing and pulsing like a living thing. Then it stepped forward. The figure was tall, its form cloaked in darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. Movements were slow, deliberate, as though savoring every step it took toward me. I couldn't move. It stopped just short of the calendar, its head tilting to one side in a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then it reached down, long, spindly fingers curling around the edges of the calendar. "What do you want?" I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure straightened, the calendar dangling loosely in its grip. Slowly, it raised its free hand and pointed at me. I stumbled back, my legs hitting the edge of the couch. Why me? What did I do? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it held up the calendar, flipping the pages with its impossibly long fingers. The sound of the rustling paper filled the room, unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. When it stopped, it pointed to a square near the end of the month. The ink bled across the page, forming a new message. "You took what wasn't yours." My mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. "What does that mean?" I demanded, though. I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it dropped the calendar to the floor, its pages fluttering wildly as it hit the ground. The ink seeped outward, staining the floor in streaks of crimson. Then it lunged. I scrambled back, throwing myself over the couch as the figure surged toward me, its form warped and twisted, its shadow stretching across the room like a tidal wave. I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a heavy lamp, and swung it wildly. The metal base passed through the figure without resistance, as though it were made of smoke. The lights flickered violently, the room plunging into darkness before flaring back to life. The figure was gone. But the whispers began. They came from everywhere at once, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. "You took it. You kept it. Now it's yours." I pressed my hands to my ears, sinking to the floor as the voices grew louder and more frantic. My head throbbed, my vision blurring as the room seemed to spin around me. "Stop," I screamed. "I don't know what you want." The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I opened my eyes, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The apartment was still again, the air heavy with the faint metallic smell of ink. The calendar lay open on the floor, its pages stained red. The message was short, written in bold, jagged strokes. Tomorrow is the end. I sat on the floor, staring at the calendar, waiting for whatever was coming. The hours crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last. When the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe the calendar had been lying. Then the clock struck 7 a.m., and the knocking started. It came from the front door, loud and insistent. My heart leapt into my throat as I stood, the calendar clutched tightly in my hands. The knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic, until the door shook in its frame. I approached slowly, every step a struggle. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. The knocking stopped. The silence was worse. Taking a deep breath, I turned the lock and opened the door. There was no one there. But sitting on the threshold, waiting for me, was the red pen. The word tomorrow burned itself into my mind. I sat on the park bench, the cool night air wrapping around me, the calendar heavy in my lap. Hands shook as I stared at the word written in that familiar, menacing red ink. I didn't know what it meant, but the dread curling in my stomach told me I didn't want to find out. People passed by, joggers, couples, a lone dog walker, but I felt completely alone, even surrounded by life. The weight of the messages bore down on me, isolating me in a way I couldn't explain. I needed help. I returned to the apartment at dawn, the streets eerily quiet in the early morning light. The shadows of the buildings stretched long and thin, and every creak of the pavement under my feet made me flinch. The front door was just as I'd left it locked. Yet, stepping inside felt like walking into the lair of something waiting for me. The calendar wasn't where I'd left it. I found it in the middle of the living room floor, lying open. The message for the day was bold and deliberate. It's here. The air in the apartment was thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I backed away, my heartbeat deafening in the silence. Something moved in the corner of my vision. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the farthest corner of the room, the shadows twisted unnaturally, writhing and pulsing like a living thing. Then it stepped forward. The figure was tall, its form cloaked in darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though savoring every step it took toward me. I couldn't move. It stopped just short of the calendar, its head tilting to one side in a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then it reached down, long, spindly fingers curling around the edges of the calendar. "What do you want?" I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure straightened, the calendar dangling loosely in its grip. Slowly, it raised its free hand and pointed at me. I stumbled back, my legs hitting the edge of the couch. Why me? What did I do? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it held up the calendar, flipping the pages with its impossibly long fingers. The sound of the rustling paper filled the room, unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. When it stopped, it pointed to a square near the end of the month. The ink bled across the page, forming a new message. "You took what wasn't yours." My mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. What does that mean? I demanded, though. I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it dropped the calendar to the floor, its pages fluttering wildly. As it hit the ground, the ink seeped outward, staining the floor in streaks of crimson. Then it lunged. I scrambled back, throwing myself over the couch as the figure surged toward me. Its form warped and twisted, its shadow stretching across the room like a tidal wave. I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a heavy lamp, and swung it wildly. The metal base passed through the figure without resistance, as though it were made of smoke. The lights flickered violently, the room plunging into darkness before flaring back to life. The figure was gone. But the whispers began. They came from everywhere at once, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. "You took it. You kept it. Now it's yours. I pressed my hands to my ears, sinking to the floor as the voices grew louder and more frantic. My head throbbed, my vision blurring as the room seemed to spin around me. Stop, I screamed. I don't know what you want. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I opened my eyes, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The apartment was still again, the air heavy with the faint metallic smell of ink. The calendar lay open on the floor, its pages stained red. The message was short, written in bold, jagged strokes. Tomorrow is the end. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor, staring at the calendar, waiting for whatever was coming. The hours crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last. When the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe the calendar had been lying. Then the clock struck 7 a.m., and the knocking started. It came from the front door, loud and insistent. My heart leapt into my throat as I stood, the calendar clutched tightly in my hands. The knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic, until the door shook in its frame. I approached slowly, every step a struggle. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. The knocking stopped. The silence was worse. Taking a deep breath, I turned the lock and opened the door. There was no one there. But sitting on the threshold, waiting for me, was the red pen. I stared at the pen lying on the threshold. It wasn't just a pen. It was the pen, the one I'd found in the hotel room, the one from my childhood, the one that had been writing the messages. Seeing it there, untouched but undeniably sinister, sent a chill racing down my spine. I didn't pick it up. I couldn't. Instead, I stepped back and slammed the door, locking it tight. But the knocking returned immediately. This time, it wasn't just at the door. It came from all around me, on the walls, the windows, even the floor beneath my feet. A rhythmic pounding that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. Then came the voices. You took it. You must finish it. There is no escape. The apartment began to shift. The walls warped and stretched, the corners of the room twisting into impossible angles. The lights flickered, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move on their own. And then, the calendar began to glow. The red ink burned like fire, the letters bleeding across the pages in a chaotic frenzy. Words appeared and vanished faster than I could read them, overlapping in jagged streaks that seemed to pulse with life. One phrase stood out among the chaos. Pick up the pen. My chest tightened as I stared at the glowing calendar. The knocking grew louder, more urgent, shaking the entire apartment. No, I screamed, backing away. I'm not doing this. The voices grew sharper, their tone almost pleading now. Pick it up. It's the only way. I stumbled toward the calendar, the pen still lying untouched on the floor. The air around me felt thick, as though the apartment itself was pressing down on me, forcing me toward the object. With trembling hands, I picked up the pen. The room went silent. The air grew still, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The glowing ink on. The calendar steadied, forming a single, clear message. Write your truth. Your truth. I hesitated, the pen shaking in my grip. What does that mean? I whispered. The voices didn't answer. I knelt by the calendar, the blank squares seeming to stretch endlessly before me. The pen felt heavier now, almost alive, as though it pulsed with its own heartbeat. And then, I understood. The calendar wasn't a warning. It wasn't a threat. It was a demand for me to confront the part of myself I'd tried so hard to bury. I began to write. The pen moved almost on its own, dragging words out of me that I hadn't realized were there. Memories flooded back, things I'd forgotten or tried to forget. Moments of guilt, regret, pain. The ink spilled across the pages, filling each square with fragments of my past. The time I lied to someone I loved. The friend I abandoned when they needed me most. The mistakes I made and the truths I ignored. As I wrote, the apartment seemed to calm. The walls straightened, the light stopped flickering, and the oppressive weight lifted. When I finally set the pen down, the calendar was filled. Every square, every page, a chaotic tapestry of my life. The last square read, "It's done." I stared at the calendar, my hand still trembling. The pen lay still now, its weight ordinary. Its ink dried. The knocking stopped. The voices faded. And for the first time in days, the apartment was silent. I tried to return to normal. The calendar remained on the wall, its pages now blank, as though the messages had never been there. But I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel the weight of the pen in my hand, the pull of the truth's eye, wrote. And sometimes, when I glance at the calendar out of the corner of my eye, I think I see faint traces of red ink, just waiting to return. I don't know if it's over. But I do know this. The messages weren't just warnings. They were something far worse. A reminder. What would you have done if cryptic messages appeared in your home? Share your thoughts in the comments below.